Black engineer ignored in a key company meeting. She unveiled the prototype that secured the contract and left them speechless. The silk cover draped over the table looked harmless. Elegant, even. But in this room, under the cold glow of recessed lighting, it was the kind of harmless that could change the future of the company in a single breath. Every seat around the polished conference table was filled. Executives in tailored suits, the international client's delegation in crisp formality, assistants poised with notepads that would later become official history. At the head of the table, the CEO's hand hovered over the fabric. His voice carried a tremor he didn't bother hiding. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed, we have a surprise." The word lingered in the air, almost afraid to move forward. Across the table, Greg Mallory, the golden boy of the engineering department, sat with his signature smirk, the picture of a man certain the spotlight belonged to him. His chin tilted upward, just enough to claim the moment before it arrived. The CEO's fingers gripped the edge of the silk. "This," he said, "is the prototype we believe will secure the contract." A breathless pause. Every eye turned toward Greg. The silence was his crown. And then, from the far end of the room, a voice. Calm, measured, unshaken. "I built it." The words cut through the air like glass snapping in two. Heads turned sharply, confusion flickering across every face. Greg's smirk froze, not in shock, but in the recognition of something he hadn't prepared for. You could feel it, even without knowing the story. The weight behind those three words. The months of erasure, the careful theft of credit, the silent patience of someone who'd been pushed aside again and again, until the exact right moment to step forward. No one in that room knew the full history yet, but they would, and when they did, they'd understand that this unveiling was more than a presentation. It was the opening move of a reckoning. Aisha Reynolds was the kind of engineer who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, at least, not by those who valued results over noise. In a world of corporate handshakes and carefully packaged charm, she was all precision and quiet force. Her workstation, tucked into the far corner of the design floor, looked less like a desk and more like a command center. Dual monitors glowing with schematics, tools laid out with surgical accuracy, and a small potted plant that somehow thrived under the pale light of overhead fluorescence. She built machines that solved problems no one else could. Machines that worked the first time, because she refused to let them leave her hands until they did. But brilliance alone isn't armor. Not here. Not in this building of gleaming glass towers, where the lobby smelled faintly of money, and the air was kept just cold enough to keep people from lingering. The executives liked their engineers smart enough to build, but quiet enough to be invisible. And Aisha, black female, and unwilling to play the politics of polished smiles, wasn't the type they liked to spotlight. The one who lived in the spotlight was Greg Mallory. Greg had the walk of a man who believed every hallway was his runway. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that always seemed freshly cut, he wore tailored suits to design meetings as if every brainstorming session were a photo op. He didn't carry schematics, he carried confidence, and it worked. Not because he was a genius, but because he knew how to take a win that wasn't his, and make it look like it had been born in his hands. In meetings, Greg laughed just loud enough to be heard by the higher-ups, his voice dropping into a lower register when talking to clients, like he was letting them in on a secret no one else deserved to hear. He was charming in a way that made people lean in, and slippery in a way that made truth slide right off him. Aisha knew his type the moment she met him. She'd been at the company for just under a year when Greg first introduced himself. "You're the MIT recruit, right?" he'd said, leaning against the frame of her cubicle like he owned it. "Heard you've got a sharp mind. Let's see if it can keep up." She'd smiled, just barely, and gone back to her work without answering. From that moment, Greg's curiosity about her shifted into something sharper. It wasn't that he didn't respect her skill, it was that he saw it as a resource. Something to mine, something he could package in his own wrapping and present to the board as his personal triumph. And in this company, that was easy to do. The culture was polished to a mirror shine, the kind where handshakes carried more weight than patents, and an executive's opinion could outweigh the data on the page. The offices were an open floor plan for the engineers, glass-walled sanctuaries for the executives, and a constant silent performance for everyone in between. People smiled at each other in the elevator, and whispered about each other when the doors closed. Aisha had been invited to fewer client meetings than her track record deserved. When she did attend, she noticed how often the introductions skipped her name, or how the executive's eyes drifted toward Greg when she spoke, as if waiting for him to confirm whether her words had value. Greg thrived in that environment. He played golf with the CTO. He accidentally bumped into the VP of Finance at the exclusive downtown cigar lounge. He was the kind of man whose calendar was as full of social maneuvers as it was of project deadlines. And while Aisha was in the lab, perfecting a prototype's thermal stability, Greg was in someone's office, perfecting his next promotion. Still, Aisha wasn't the kind of woman who needed the room to clap when she walked in. She didn't care for performative power. Her satisfaction came in the hum of a motor running exactly as she'd designed it, in the faint warmth of polished metal after hours of calibration, in the way an impossible idea turned into something you could hold. But she noticed the omissions. She noticed when Greg's name appeared in the company-wide email announcing a breakthrough on the Delta project without hers beside it. She noticed when her own design renderings appeared in a slide deck Greg was presenting to a client in Paris, a meeting she hadn't been invited to. She noticed, and she remembered. Greg thought she was harmless, quiet, the kind of quiet you could ignore, or use. What he didn't understand was that her quiet wasn't the absence of fight, it was the storing of it. The kind of quiet that builds, sharpens, and waits for the exact moment to cut clean through. For now, she worked. She kept her head down, her notes private, her blueprints backed up on encrypted drives Greg didn't know existed. The glass towers above her might have belonged to men like him, but the foundation of their success, the work that actually held it up, was hers. And sooner or later, she knew, there would be a day when the glass wouldn't protect him. The conference room was all glass and steel, a sky-level box suspended above the city, with a view designed to remind anyone sitting inside that this company played at the very top. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, polished to a mirrored shine, surrounded by leather chairs that seemed to embrace the chosen few who occupied them. On the far side, the international delegation had arrived in precise formation, navy suits, subtle pins on their lapels, hands resting neatly over crisp portfolios. Aisha sat halfway down the table, laptop open, notes pulled up, schematics stored in the muscle memory of her mind. Her posture was relaxed, but her focus was sharp. This meeting was the culmination of months of work, the endless iterations, the late nights at her desk, when the building was nearly empty, the quiet satisfaction of watching a design come alive piece by piece. The client lead leaned forward, smiling warmly. "So tell us about the thermal efficiency breakthrough." "We've heard interesting things." Aisha opened her mouth. The key was adjusting the Greg's voice slid over hers like a curtain being drawn. "What we did," he said smoothly, "was rethink the airflow from a systems perspective." The words were close enough to hers to sound collaborative, but twisted just enough to center him. His eyes never met hers. They stayed fixed on the client, that confident tilt to his head, as if he were sharing a secret no one else deserved to know. She tried again minutes later, answering a question about durability. "Our field simulations show a 20%. Greg cut in, leaning forward with an easy laugh. "It's actually closer to 22, depending on how you define stress points. We pushed the boundaries, no question about it." The executives nodded, pens moving. The clients smiled. It was a small thing, each interruption, but they stacked like stones in a wall, shutting her out one layer at a time. When the discussion shifted to the concept phase of the prototype, her heart gave a quiet, stubborn thump. This was her ground. No one in this room had spent more time shaping it, refining it, coaxing it from raw material into a functioning reality. The client, an older man with silver hair, and the kind of voice that could fill a stadium without trying, leaned back in his chair. "Whoever came up with that initial design deserves serious recognition." He turned, smiling at Greg. "Your vision set quite the foundation." Her hands froze on the keyboard. The words landed with the soft thud of a blade in the gut, not unexpected, but still capable of taking the air from your lungs. Greg gave a modest shrug, as if embarrassed by the praise. Well, I had some help from the team, he said, his tone suggesting the help had been minimal. The implication was clear. The concept was his. The months of testing, iteration, and redesign, his domain. The fact that Aisha had built the entire structure from the ground up, both literally and in code, was erased with a single exchange. She watched the faces around the table, not a flicker of protest, not a single glance her way to confirm the truth. If they knew, they weren't going to say it. If they didn't, they weren't going to ask. And woven into the fabric of that silence was something she knew well, the unspoken calculation. She was the only black woman in this room. Her authority wasn't just doubted, it was discounted, filed under probably a support role before she even walked in. Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing one ankle over his knee. Of course it's still in refinement, he said, almost as an afterthought. We'll need to make sure the final specs meet the client's needs. The client laughed. If the final product is anything like your concept, Greg, we're in excellent hands. Aisha's pulse slowed, not in defeat, but in the way a predator's does before it strikes. She typed something onto her notes, not because she needed the record, but because it kept her hands from moving in ways that would give her away. There was no flush of anger on her face, no tightening of her jaw, just stillness. A stillness Greg had mistaken for passivity since the day they met. Let him think it, because she understood what most people in rooms like this never did. Victories claimed too early have a way of rotting in your hands, and when the time came to take this one back, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. She would only need the truth, delivered at the moment it would hurt the most. So she smiled faintly when the meeting ended, even as Greg accepted another round of congratulations. She closed her laptop, rose from her chair, and left without a word. But in her mind, the clock had already started ticking. It started quietly, the kind of sabotage that didn't scream treachery, just whispered it in ways that could be denied later. Aisha logged in one morning, to find her access to the Delta Project's master folder had been accidentally revoked. An IT ticket was already open, but it took 3 days for the issue to be resolved. By then, Greg had uploaded a new version of the design files. Her annotations were gone. Her improvements, months of refinement, erased from the official record. The next week, she noticed her calendar looked lighter. Too light. No weekly client check-ins, no product review meeting. At first she thought it might be an oversight, until she overheard Greg in the hallway, chuckling with the project coordinator about keeping things efficient. Too many cooks, he said, his tone casual. Besides, she's more of a theory person, not exactly ready for the big room. The coordinator laughed along, not realizing Aisha was just around the corner. She didn't confront him, not yet. Every slight became another data point. She kept meticulous notes, dates, times, witnesses when she could. She screenshotted version histories. She saved emails in a private folder, labeling them like specimens in a lab. Greg was methodical, but so was she. The difference was, he didn't think she was watching. The office itself made the game easier for him. Glass-walled executive suites at the edges, open-plan workstations in the center, visibility without accountability. From her desk, she could see Greg moving between clusters of junior engineers, leaning on a partition, smiling that easy smile. She'd catch fragments of his voice. We'll simplify the architecture. She overcomplicates it. Or yeah, the concept's solid, but I'm making it buildable. The words reached the young staff like gospel. They started coming to him with questions that should have been hers. She could feel the shift in their eyes. Less curiosity, more skepticism. When they asked for her input, she'd sit in the back of project presentations now, her work delivered by Greg's voice. Her slides, stripped of her name, clicked by under his narration. Every time a client nodded, or a director scribbled an approving note, it was another chip in the facade of her presence here. In those moments, the weight was physical, like sitting behind glass while someone took your fingerprints off a masterpiece you'd painted, replacing them with their own. Late at night, when the floor was empty, she'd stay behind. The hum of the HVAC was the only sound as she worked on her private build, her prototype, her version of the project, the one untouched by Greg's hands. She moved with precision,
her mind replaying the day's thefts, as if each one were fuel. She began to notice the patterns in his sabotage. Files would corrupt right after she submitted them. Meeting invites would disappear only for her, never for the others. Draft reports she'd authored would arrive back to her inbox edited, her technical language smoothed into vague marketing fluff, her equations stripped out, her name quietly missing from the metadata. To anyone else, it would look like normal project churn. To her, it was a clear signal. Greg wasn't just taking credit, he was erasing her completely. But he didn't know she had a longer memory than he did. Every erased line, every stolen sentence, every meeting she'd been kept from, it was all going into the ledger. And when the day came to settle it, she'd have more than just proof. She'd have the kind of precision strike that leaves nothing standing. So she kept her silence. In the glass and steel hive of that office, Greg mistook it for surrender. But Aisha was already moving, quietly, inside her own timeline. And in her mind, the countdown had already begun. Rewind the clock. Long before Greg began tightening his grip on the project, Aisha had already started building something of her own. Not a concept, not a half-finished model, a full, working prototype, quietly taking shape far away from the company servers, far away from the reach of anyone who might twist it into their own. It lived in a place no one at the firm would think to look, her personal workshop, a converted storage unit on the south side of the city. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. A dented roll-up door, a faded unit number, and a single overhead bulb that flickered when the weather turned. Inside, it was an engineer's sanctuary. Steel workbenches lined with precision tools, shelves stacked with labeled containers, fasteners, bearings, custom machined parts, a soldering station, a high-resolution 3D printer, humming in the corner, and in the center, under a clean canvas tarp, the shape of the machine she'd been perfecting in secret. She worked there in the quiet hours, early mornings before the office opened, late nights when the rest of the city slept. No one knew, not her co-workers, not her friends, not even her neighbors. She kept her tools, organized the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation, every step measured, every calculation checked twice. The design files never touched company servers. She used an old set of access codes from a long-forgotten sandbox environment, back when the IT department hadn't yet purged inactive accounts. Those codes let her pull down the raw material she needed, schematics, part dimensions, component specs, without leaving a trace in the active logs. Everything else, she built herself. Her laptop, disconnected from the company network, held the heart of the project. Encrypted drives, triple backups, time-stamped design revisions, dating back to the very first draft, each one marked with her initials, each one carrying metadata that proved ownership beyond question. She kept printed copies of the critical stages, sealed in envelopes, stored in a locked fireproof box in the corner of the workshop. And there was more. Weeks earlier, when the client had first shown interest in the Delta project, Aisha had taken the time to build a direct but discreet channel with their technical advisor. Just enough communication to share clarifications, nothing that would violate policy, but enough to leave a paper trail. Each exchange confirmed her as the primary designer, each one preserved in her private archive. Greg's sabotage could touch the public face of the project. He could erase her name from reports, strip her annotations from shared files, even present her concepts as his own. But he couldn't touch what he didn't know existed. Here, in this workshop, every piece of her work was intact, untouched. It wasn't just a backup, it was a weapon. And as she tightened the last bolt on the prototype's chassis, wiped a streak of grease from her hand, and powered the system for the first time, she felt it, that subtle shift inside her, the one where survival stopped being the goal. Now she wasn't just holding her ground, she was setting the trap. In the coming weeks, she would let Greg keep pushing, let him believe the erasure was working, let him step further into the role he'd stolen. Because when the moment came to pull back the curtain, she wouldn't just prove him wrong, she'd prove him irrelevant. In her mind, the outcome was already locked. The only question left was how publicly she wanted him to fall. Aisha stopped trying to block Greg's moves. Instead, she opened the door wider. She began leaving pieces of her work, just enough to look complete, where she knew he'd find them. Blueprints missing a single critical measurement, circuit diagrams with one subtle connection reversed, stress test simulations, calculated on a faulty parameter, that only revealed itself when the build reached full load. Greg took the bait every time. In meetings, he would beam as he unveiled his solutions, sleek slides, confident hand gestures, the polished cadence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. And each time, she would watch the executive's approving nods, knowing that somewhere down the line, the design in his hands would crack apart under pressure. She never reacted when it happened, when prototypes sputtered during testing, when assembly delays piled up because a part didn't fit as specified, when his refinements cost them days in troubleshooting. She stayed silent, let him stand in front of the boardroom screen with the faintest hint of sweat along his hairline, explaining why his breakthrough wasn't quite ready yet. If they glanced her way in those moments, she'd simply give a small polite nod, not smug, not defensive, just observing. The more he scrambled, the more mistakes he made. He started pushing the junior engineers harder, snapping at them when the fixes didn't come fast enough. The easy charm he'd worn like armor began to chip. He looked over his shoulder more often in meetings, as if expecting a blow that never came. Meanwhile, she was working a different angle. Weeks earlier, she'd reached out to the international client's technical advisor, under the pretense of clarifying some specifications. The exchanges were brief, professional, but precise, each one leaving a traceable record of her authorship, her insight, her problem-solving. Now those conversations began to pivot, not toward the sabotage Greg was sinking in, but toward something else entirely. She suggested a private demonstration, not for the board, not for Greg, for the client's technical team alone. A session where they could see the prototype in action before the final presentation. No noise, no middleman, just the machine, running exactly as it should. They agreed, so she kept feeding Greg half-answers and flawed data, her expression steady, her demeanor untouched. To him, it looked like she'd withdrawn, like she'd accepted her place in the background, and that was the beauty of it, because Greg didn't know that the next time the client saw the Delta project, it wouldn't be his version they remembered. It would be hers, and it would work perfectly. Until then, she let him dig. Every overconfident step, every corner he cut, every problem he papered over, he was digging deeper. And when the fall came, she wouldn't need to push. He'd already built the hole himself. The boardroom was packed, the air thick with that taut, electric silence that always came before a deal of this size. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled pale winter light across the long table, making the polished surface gleam like a stage. The international delegation sat at one end, their expressions calm but unreadable. The executives lined the other, each with their hands folded neatly over printouts, pens aligned like surgical tools. At the center, standing beside a veiled object on a steel cart, was Greg. Tailored suit, polished shoes, smile locked in place. He radiated the confidence of a man about to close the biggest deal of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "what you're about to see is the culmination of months of tireless work. Our Delta prototype, designed to exceed your expectations in both performance and reliability." He tugged the silk cover away with a practiced flourish. The prototype gleamed under the overhead lights, every surface buffed to perfection. He pressed the activation switch. The machine sputtered, stalled. A grinding noise filled the air, harsh and awkward. Greg's smile twitched, but he tried to keep talking. "Just a minor." A thin wisp of smoke curled up from one of the vents. CEO's expression didn't shift much, but the way her eyes hardened was enough to draw a quiet ripple through the room. Greg fumbled for words. "We, just need to reset." The client's lead, a man who had barely spoken all morning, raised his hand slightly. "Can we see, Isha Reynolds' version?" The sentence cut the room in half. Heads turned. Greg froze, the smile gone now, replaced with a flicker of something close to panic. Aisha rose from her chair at the far end, calm, unhurried. She walked to the second cart parked against the wall, its own prototype, hidden under a clean white sheet. Her steps made no sound on the carpet, but the room seemed to quiet even more as she reached the front. Without a word, she removed the cover. Her version wasn't dressed up with unnecessary shine. It was precise, functional, beautiful in its purpose. She powered it on. No sputter, no smoke. The soft, steady hum filled the air like the first clean note of a symphony. She ran the demonstration flawlessly. Thermal efficiency, load handling, stress response, all exactly as the specs promised. The client's technical team leaned in, exchanging rapid murmurs. When she finished, the applause came, not loud and chaotic, but sharp and deliberate. Greg's face had gone pale. Aisha reached into her briefcase and placed a folder on the table in front of the CEO. Development logs, she said evenly. Time-stamped, full revision history, client communications. My authorship is documented from concept to completion. CEO opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. Around the table, the executive's eyes shifted, from the prototype to Greg, then back to Aisha. Greg tried to speak, but nothing came. In that moment, the shift was complete. The room that had always looked past her now couldn't look anywhere else. The silence after the demonstration lingered for just a heartbeat. Then the CEO spoke. Her voice was crisp, decisive. The contract is ours, she said, turning to the client with the kind of measured certainty that left no room for doubt. And it is thanks to the work of Aisha Reynolds. The words landed like a final verdict. Pens moved, hands shook. The largest deal in the company's history was sealed right there at the table. Then came the other verdict. Greg, the CEO continued without looking at him, effective immediately. You are relieved of your position. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. But it cut deeper than either could have done. The kind of sentence that left no oxygen for argument. Greg's mouth opened, but whatever excuse he'd been reaching for dissolved before it could form. He just stood there, shrinking in a room that no longer held a place for him. The meeting ended quickly after that. Contracts were signed. Handshakes exchanged. The delegation left with smiles that were genuine this time. The executives filed out, voices hushed, eyes glancing toward Aisha, as if seeing her for the first time. She gathered her things without hurry. The folder with the signed agreement slid into her bag, its weight solid and certain. She stepped into the hallway, the muted click of her heels, the only sound against the carpet. No one stopped her. No one dared. The winter air outside was sharp and clean. She crossed the plaza in front of the glass tower, the sun catching on the steel and glass behind her. In the reflection, the building looked smaller somehow. Back at her apartment, she set the bag on the counter and slipped the contract into a drawer. Then she crossed to a shelf in the corner, lined not with awards or framed certificates, but with objects that told a quieter story. Tools, blueprints, and now, the completed prototype. She placed it there carefully, not as a trophy, not as proof to anyone else, but as a reminder to herself that the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs the right moment to be seen. So let me ask you, if you were in Aisha's place, would you have waited? Would you have let him keep digging, feeding him just enough rope to weave his own noose? Or would you have struck the moment you caught the first trace of sabotage? Because revenge, real revenge, isn't just about the win. It's about timing. It's about letting the truth grow so undeniable that when it finally breaks the surface, it doesn't just topple your enemy. It erases the very shadow they tried to cast over you. Maybe you've been there, overlooked, erased, someone else taking your work, your credit, your place. If you have, you know the burn of wanting to make them pay. So tell me in the comments, what's your philosophy? Quick strike, or slow burn? And if you know someone who's been pushed aside, silenced, or underestimated, share this story with them. Because the sweetest revenge isn't just proving them wrong, it's making yourself undeniable.